The old Zenith radio was a family heirloom, heavy, veneered mahogany, and stubbornly analog in a world that had long since gone digital. It sat in the corner of my attic office, usually just a dust magnet, until the night the air conditioning died during the July heatwave. Desperate for anything that wasn't the oppressive, buzzing quiet of a power-saver home, I hauled the Zenith out and plugged it in. The dial glowed a weak, amber orange. I started sweeping the band, finding nothing but the usual hiss and pops of empty frequencies. Then, around 98.7 MHz, a frequency I knew, even as a kid, was reserved for nothing but dead air, the static cleared that it wasn't music. It wasn't a broadcast that it was a sound that instantly dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees, despite the 90-degree heat outside. It was the distinct, rhythmic thump-drag, of something impossibly heavy being moved across a wooden floor, punctuated by a wet, ragged inhalation that my hand froze on the tuning knob. This wasn't interference. It had a pattern, a horrifyingly deliberate rhythm. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching the grill cloth. The sound stopped. For a full 5 seconds, there was absolute silence, the kind of silence that feels like pressure building in your eardrums. Then, a voice. Not loud, but close, as if the speaker was whispering directly into the radio's microphone, or maybe, directly into my ear. It was a man's voice, raspy, old, and dripping with a chilling effort. "Did you hear that?" he breathed. That I scrambled backward, knocking my desk chair over. My heart hammered against my ribs. It's a prank. A pirate station. Some late-night weirdo. I reached to turn the knob, to bury the sound under white noise, but my fingers wouldn't obey. Curiosity, that ancient, fatal flaw, held me captive. The third step, the voice continued, clearer now, sounding less like a broadcast and more like a confession over a bad connection. It always sticks on the third step. You have to lift it. If you don't lift it, she notices. A sudden, sharp crackle burst from the speaker, followed by a sound I recognized with nauseating certainty, the distinct, high-pitched squeak of a door hinge that needed oiling. A hinge I hadn't heard in years, not since my grandmother sold the ancestral farmhouse 5 years ago. The voice on the Zenith whispered, a raw plea this time, tell them not to go to the attic. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the frequency dissolved back into the familiar, empty hiss of 98.7 MHz. I ripped the plug from the wall socket, the dead air rushing back in, thick and suffocating. That I stood there, shaking, staring at the silent, inert radio. The farmhouse. My grandmother's house. The attic. I hadn't thought about that place in years, not since the sale closed. Later that night, I pulled up the county records online, needing to confirm something my gut was screaming. I found the old property listing, the pictures digitized and faded. One photo stood out, the rear entrance, showing the back porch. And there, clearly visible leading up to the second-floor access, were the wooden steps. That I counted them, my blood turning to ice water. 1, 2, 3. The third step on my grandmother's back porch was notorious. It always squeaked, and if you put too much weight on it without shifting your balance just right, it would stick and groan until you lifted your foot clear. That I deleted the browser history, shut down the computer, and threw a heavy blanket over the Zenith. I told myself it was coincidence, the heat, exhaustion, but I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. Tell them not to go to the attic. Why? And who was she? It wasn't until the next evening, when I was clearing out the last box of my grandmother's things I'd stored in my own dusty attic, that I found the small, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a stack of moth-eaten linens. The cover was warped, the pages brittle. That I opened it to the first entry marked with a date from 1952. The handwriting was shaky, elegant, and utterly terrified. October 14, 1952. He brought it home today. The silence is already too loud. He said it would help with the farm work. Help. I saw its shadow stretch across the hall when the lamp flickered. It breathes in the static that I looked back towards the corner where the Zenith sat, buried under the blanket. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. I flipped the page, my hands clammy. October 17, 1952. We can hear it moving at night now. Not walking. Dragging. It's too heavy for just one man to drag, and I know my husband isn't the only one downstairs. I locked the attic door. But what good is a lock if whatever is out there is listening through the wires? The diary felt like a piece of charged iron in my hands. The ink seemed impossibly dark for such old paper. I forced myself to read another entry, needing to know what it was that breathed in the static. October 21, 1952. I tried to talk to Thomas about the sounds. He just smiled, that empty, distant smile, and changed the frequency. He says the interference is necessary for the reception. He's lying. The radio doesn't receive broadcasts anymore, it receives him. And I keep hearing the same loop. The thump-drag followed by that wet, rattling intake of breath. I swear it knows my name that I flipped several pages forward, skipping over mundane farm notes until I found a passage underlined 3 times in frantic, desperate strokes. November 1, 1952. I finally understood what the third step was for. It's a threshold. The thing downstairs, it cannot easily ascend if it has to stop and adjust its weight over that specific spot. It's cumbersome. Slow. But Thomas, my Thomas, he keeps tuning the dial, widening the band, trying to bring the signal closer. He says the voice is getting clearer. The voice who warns me that I stopped reading. The voice on the radio last night had warned me about the attic. My grandmother's diary suggested that the victim, or perhaps the original transmitter of the warning, was trying to keep the entity downstairs. But why was the radio in my attic now? And why did the warning shift its location? I looked at the blanket-shrouded Zenith, suddenly feeling trapped in the room with it. If the entity was linked to the radio frequency, then my grandmother must have used it too. That afternoon, I made a decision. I had to know if the frequency was still active, but I wouldn't be broadcasting into the darkness again. I dug out my old, high-gain amateur radio scanner from a box in the garage, a modern digital unit, capable of precision sweeping, that I set it up next to the Zenith. It felt like confronting a ghost with a Geiger counter. I programmed the scanner to hold steady on 98.7 MHz and hit the power button. The digital readout flickered to life. Silence. Pure, digitized silence. No hiss, no anomaly. It was just an empty frequency on modern equipment. Frustration warred with relief. Had the connection broken? Had the entity, or the man speaking, simply stopped broadcasting? I turned to the Zenith, ready to throw it out, when I noticed something subtle about the old dial. The pointer wasn't perfectly centered on 98.7 MHz. It was nudged just barely to the left, closer to 98.6 MHz, an analog sliver of frequency that my digital scanner wasn't set to monitor. I leaned in, my breath catching. The Zenith was old, its tuning mechanism was imprecise. Maybe the dead zone wasn't a single point, but a small area around the supposed frequency. Slowly, cautiously, I reached out and gently nudged the Zenith's tuning knob, just a millimeter clockwise, until the amber glow seemed to brighten slightly. The scanner next to it remained silent, but the Zenith, oh, the Zenith, it erupted. It wasn't the thump-drag this time. It was immediate, overwhelming noise, a shrieking, feedback-laden roar that felt like physical pain inside my skull. It sounded like 1,000 voices screaming through a broken filter, then, cutting through the chaos, a single, crystal-clear sound, the distinct, repetitive clink, clink, clink of metal striking stone, impossibly loud. It sounded like a shovel hitting bedrock. Directly beneath me, the blanket covering the Zenith began to vibrate, not from the speaker, but from the mahogany casing itself. Suddenly, the volume dropped, as if a massive hand had muffled the speaker from the inside. The voice returned, deeper, angrier than before, layered with distortion. "You moved the anchor," the voice hissed, the sound scraping against my nerves. "The connection is unstable now. She thinks she's safe in the rafters, but the weight follows the strongest current." The clink, clink, clink grew faster, more frantic, sounding less like digging and more like something trying desperately to break through the floorboards beneath the house. "The attic is where you hide the box, boy. But the box has always belonged to the cellar." The sound cut out, replaced by a sound that made my stomach drop, a slow, deliberate, scratching sound originating from directly behind the wall paneling next to my desk that I bolted out of the office, slamming the door, and leaned against the landing railing, gasping for air. The scratching stopped almost instantly, replaced by a profound, unsettling quiet throughout the entire house that I knew what I had to do. I had to find out what was in the cellar of the old farmhouse, the place my grandmother had warned away from. I needed the next entry from that diary. I retreated downstairs, heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the image of my drywall vibrating burned behind my eyelids. I grabbed the leather diary from the desk, I wouldn't leave it up there, and retreated to the brightest room in the house, the kitchen. That I opened the book again, scanning past the entries about the entity's heavy movements and the husband's strange behavior. I was looking for anything describing the cellar, the anchor, or a box. I found it 3 entries later, the handwriting reduced to a tight, almost illegible scrawl, as if the writer was hiding the words in the spine of the book. November 5, 1952. "Thomas stopped speaking entirely this morning. He just stands by the cellar door and stares at the knot in the wood grain. I saw the box in his hands. It's heavy, dark iron, cold even from across the room. He's going to put it back. He keeps muttering about rebalancing the current. He doesn't understand, putting it back just makes the receiver stronger. It's not the box he fears, it's what it contains." November 6, 1952. I found the key. He hid it in the chimney flue, the old, unused one in the parlor fireplace. If he opens that box down there, if he lets whatever she is out of that containment, the attic will be the least of our worries. I have to go first. I must hide the key where the static can never reach it. The entry ended there. The next page was smeared with what looked like dried mud, not ink, and the following pages were simply ripped out, leaving jagged, empty remnants. "The man on the radio last night, was he Thomas? Was he warning me about his wife, the she mentioned here, or was he warning me about himself? And what about the box?" The narrator from the radio said the box belonged in the cellar. My grandmother's diary said Thomas was trying to put it back in the cellar. This was contradictory to the warning. She thinks she's safe in the rafters, but the weight follows the strongest current. The current seemed to flow through the radio, connecting the attic, where I was, and the cellar, the entity's purported origin, that I needed physical proof. I needed to see that house again. That I called the realtor who handled the sale 5 years ago, feigning interest in buying a comparable property nearby. After 20 minutes of pointless small talk, I steered the conversation toward the old farmhouse. "Oh, the Hemlock place. It sold fast, surprisingly," the realtor chirped. "The new owners gutted it, though. Apparently, the cellar foundation was a nightmare. They had to reinforce everything. Did you know it had a very unusual, deep subcellar? Brick-lined, almost like a cistern, built under the original stone foundation. Locals always whispered about it. Seemed awfully deep for just storing root vegetables. A brick-lined cistern under the foundation. A place built to hold something heavy, something that needed to be kept away from the main house structure. The anchor that I hung up, my mind racing. If Thomas was trying to put the box back in the cellar, and my grandmother hid the key, the current broadcast was a desperate plea from a trapped Thomas, trying to warn someone about whatever was loose, or worse, warning me to keep the key away from the cellar. That I looked at the Zenith, still covered, still radiating a faint, almost imperceptible unease into the room. I needed that key. That I grabbed my keys, a powerful flashlight, and drove the 2 hours toward the old property, my stomach churning with a grim sense of inherited duty. The house was dark, windows clouded with neglect. Even under new ownership, it seemed the new owners were busy with the foundation work and hadn't moved in yet. I used the spare key my grandmother had given me years ago for emergencies. She never specified what kind of emergency, which, thankfully, the new owners hadn't changed. The air inside was cold and stale, smelling of damp earth and ancient dust. I ignored the ground floor and headed straight for the parlor, the place where the diary said the key was hidden in the unused flue. The fireplace was cold, filled with old debris. I shone my flashlight up the dark chimney shaft. Nothing. I checked the sides, the damper mechanism, probing every crevice. Then, I remembered the entry. He hid it in the chimney flue, the old, unused one in the parlor fireplace. My house only had one parlor fireplace. But my grandmother's farmhouse had a parlor and a sitting room. Maybe Thomas hadn't hidden it in the main parlor fireplace, but the one in the secondary room she might have called the parlor. In a moment of confusion or fear that I found the sitting room, another cold hearth. I shone the light inside. About a foot up, lodged tight against the soot-blackened brickwork, I saw a small, dull glint. It wasn't metal, but something dark and petrified, almost organic. Using a long, thin pair of needle-nose pliers I'd brought, I managed to hook the object and gently pull it free. It wasn't a key. It was a piece of hardened, petrified wood, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. Tied to it with a piece of thin, brittle twine was a single, tarnished brass key. The key looked old, ornate, and utterly wrong for any modern lock. As I held the key in my palm, the air around me didn't just get cold, it felt heavy, as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled, and from somewhere deep within the house, a sound echoed up through the floorboards, faint, but unmistakable. Thump-drag, thump-drag, it was coming from below. From the cellar. The thump-drag echoing from below was too slow, too burdened to be a quick search. It was the sound of something enormous being painfully maneuvered across stone. The sound confirmed the diary entry. Thomas was down there, or it was down there, and the iron box was involved. Clutching the tarnished brass key and the heavy diary, I found the cellar entrance back in the kitchen, hidden beneath a trapdoor in the floorboards. The new owners, in their haste to reinforce the foundation, had neglected the lock on this secondary access, perhaps thinking the main basement entrance was sufficient. That I lifted the trapdoor. The air that rushed up was subterranean, smelling of wet clay, iron oxide, and something deeply, fundamentally wrong, a smell like ozone mixed with spoiled meat. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing steep, uneven wooden stairs leading into absolute blackness. I hesitated. This was where the radio warning led. This was the anchor. Tell them not to go to the attic, the static voice had pleaded. But the diary suggested the immediate danger was the cellar. I had to secure whatever Thomas was trying to contain. Taking a deep breath, I descended. The stairs groaned under my weight, a familiar complaint, but underneath it, I thought I could hear a faint, metallic scrape in response to my footfalls. The main cellar was dirt-floored, damp, and surprisingly clear, thanks to the renovation work. Reinforcement beams crisscrossed the ceiling. But tucked in the far corner, beneath where the floor plan suggested the original structure ended, was a section clearly newer, expertly laid, perfectly dry brickwork, forming a round, sealed archway. The cistern the realtor mentioned. There was a heavy iron ring set into the center of the brickwork, meant for lifting a manhole cover. I used the pliers to clear the surrounding dirt. A single, ancient, heavy-duty padlock secured the ring to an embedded bolt. It was an old, crude locking mechanism, the brass key fit. It turned with a deep, metallic thunk that resonated through the silent space that I pulled the iron ring. The sound was deafening in the close space, a high-pitched screech of metal on brick dust. The slab lifted, revealing a vertical shaft of blackness beneath. The air pouring out now was intensely cold, and the smell of decay was almost unbearable that I aimed my flashlight down. It wasn't a cistern for water. It was a circular, brick-lined pit, maybe 12 feet deep, and at the bottom, resting squarely in the center of the floor, was a heavy, black iron box, exactly as described in the diary. It was about the size of a footlocker, utterly devoid of markings, featureless, and emitting a faint, shimmering distortion in the light beam, like heat haze, and beside it, slumped against the brick wall, was a skeleton that was dressed in threadbare 1950s work clothes. A frayed leather belt held up trousers that had long since turned to dust. One bony hand, skeletal fingers still curled, rested inches from the iron box that was Thomas. He had made it down here. He had locked the box, but he hadn't made it back out, or perhaps he hadn't wanted to leave it as I leaned over the edge to confirm this grim sight. The flashlight beam caught something else in the pit, lying near the skeleton's feet. A small, crudely drawn charcoal sketch on a piece of slate that was a drawing of the Zenith radio, but inverted. The speaker cone was open, and instead of the knobs, there was a gaping, circular mouth. And emerging from that mouth was a thin, shadowy figure, a woman, whose hair seemed to be made of tangles of electrical wire. She wasn't confined to the attic. She was trying to climb out of the radio. Suddenly, a new sound rose from the pit, not a drag, but a wet, gasping sigh that seemed to originate from the very air surrounding the box. The temperature plummeted again. The faint distortion around the iron box intensified, shimmering like water. I realized, Thomas hadn't been trying to keep the box down here. He had been trying to keep her trapped inside the box, and the radio was merely the conduit that allowed his wife's spirit, or whatever she was, to communicate, to lure someone else to open the lock that I had used the key. I had broken the seal. I heard a new sound from upstairs, a floorboard creak, but this one was light, almost delicate, the sound of stocking feet padding softly across the wood above the cellar entrance. She was here. And now she knew the box was accessible. The soft padding upstairs was nothing like the heavy thump-drag. This sound was light, agile, and carried the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking on the balls of their feet, as if trying not to break the silence, yet failing utterly. This was her. I slammed the iron lid of the cistern shut, the sound echoing like a cannon shot in the underground space. The sigh from below stopped instantly, replaced by an anxious, drawn-out hiss, the sound of steam escaping a punctured pipe. I didn't have time to relock it. The brass key was still in the lock, and the creature upstairs was already moving toward the cellar door. I scrambled up the rotten wooden steps, slamming the trapdoor shut just as the soft footsteps reached the kitchen doorway above. I didn't bother trying to lock it. I just shoved a heavy sack of abandoned tools against the door's edge. I retreated into the dining room, flashlight beam darting wildly. The kitchen was empty. The only thing out of place was a thin, almost invisible trail of black, oily residue leading from the kitchen threshold toward the main hallway, the path the entity had taken. I crept toward the hallway, gripping the heavy diary in one hand and the useless, ornate brass key in the other. The air grew colder again, not the damp cold of the cellar, but a dry, biting cold that seemed to leach the warmth directly from my bones that I stopped at the archway leading to the main staircase. The staircase ascended into shadow, and then I heard it, not from the stairs, but from the landing above. A low, vibrating sound that seemed to originate from the very wood of the banister. It was the sound of static, but modulated, woven into a low, humming drone. "You opened the way for me," the voice whispered, multiplied by the hum, echoing down from the second floor. It wasn't the raspy plea of Thomas. This voice was smooth, feminine, yet devoid of any natural breath or pitch variation, perfect, manufactured sound. "You moved the anchor. Now, the current finds the vessel." I understood then. The radio hadn't been keeping the entity out, it had been keeping her, the residual echo of Thomas's wife, trapped by his containment, from fully manifesting. By breaking the seal on the cellar box, I hadn't freed Thomas, I had given her the necessary energy to walk again. The attic receiver was just a conduit for the spirit trapped below, and now that the containment was broken, she had a new anchor, me that I lifted my flashlight, aiming it up the stairs, preparing to bolt. The beam illuminated the landing. She was standing there, she looked like a faded photograph of my grandmother's generation, a woman in a long, grey house dress, hair meticulously pinned back. But where her eyes should have been, there were only two circular patches of swirling, flickering white noise, the visual equivalent of the Zenith's empty frequency. Her skin had a dull, waxy sheen, and she moved with a disconcerting lack of friction, gliding rather than walking. As she took a slow step down, her stockinged foot made that light, dreadful pad-pad sound. From her mouth, the perfect, synthesized whisper emerged again, closer this time. "The static needs a host, dear. The attic was too small for the broadcast. But your living frequency, it's quite strong." She raised one hand, and the air around her fingers began to visibly warp, exactly like the distortion over the iron box in the pit. I could feel a sharp, painful pressure building behind my eyes, a feedback loop starting in my own head that I didn't wait for the second step. I turned and ran for the front door, the key and the diary clutched tight. The sound of her descent followed immediately, no longer light footsteps, but a rapid, slithering rush, the static hum rising to a painful shriek that made the glass in the parlor windows visibly vibrate. That I yanked the heavy front door open and stumbled out onto the overgrown lawn, looking back only once. The shadow of the house seemed deeper, darker than it should have been, and in the second-floor window, the shimmering white noise of her eyes watched me. Retreat. That I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, speeding away. I was alive, but I was carrying something with me. Something that had followed the strongest current. As I hit the main road and finally dared to look down at my passenger seat, I saw it. Resting on the worn leather, still faintly vibrating, was the old Zenith radio. I had never brought it to the farmhouse. I had left it covered in my own attic office, miles away. It hadn't been an echo in the airwaves. It had been a lure, and I had brought the receiver, and its new anchor, home with me. The Zenith radio sat on the passenger seat like a massive, silent predator that had just finished a meal. It wasn't merely present, it felt integral to the space, radiating a low-grade hum that the car's own electrical system seemed to struggle against. How? I had unplugged it. I had left it buried under a blanket in my attic office. 2 hours away. I sped home, adrenaline masking the absurdity of the situation. I couldn't just leave the radio, or her, in the car. I threw the car into the garage and wrestled the heavy mahogany box out. It felt oddly lighter now, as if a significant portion of its density had been left behind in the farmhouse cellar, perhaps with Thomas's bones. I carried it straight to my office, intending to smash it with a sledgehammer, but as my hand reached for the tool drawer, the static hum from the radio intensified, and a small, almost imperceptible light flickered beneath the tuning dial. I froze. It doesn't need power. I dropped the sledgehammer and backed away slowly, grabbing the diary. I needed to know what Thomas's wife was after, beyond just finding a new host. That I flipped to the last decipherable entry in the diary, the one just before the smeared mud. November 6, 1952, continued. I have secured the key, hidden it where the static can never reach it. The box stays locked. If he tries to broadcast again, if he tries to bring it here, I must ensure the connection is dead. The radio is the channel. The box is the seal. The attic is merely where the signal is amplified. Amplified. That was the key word. The farmhouse attic had been an amplifier. My office, perhaps, was the new receiving station. That I backed toward the doorway, keeping my eyes locked on the Zenith. The faint flicker stopped, then, the digital clock on my computer monitor flickered erratically. 9:15 a.m. turned into 9:59 a.m., then jumped back to 9:16 a.m., a small, localized time distortion centered around the radio. The Zenith remained silent, unplugged, but the air in the room was growing heavy with that familiar, oppressive cold. Suddenly, the radio spoke, but not through the speakers. The sound seemed to emanate from the wood grain itself, a dry, cracking noise like bark splitting in winter. "You shouldn't have run," the smooth, humming voice said, sounding bored now, as if reciting a line from an old script. The attic was too far away to anchor the broadcast successfully. "But your house has strong grounding. And you brought me the necessary frequency booster." I looked down at the diary in my hands. The leather cover felt slick, almost warm. "The radio is just wood and wire," I managed, my voice trembling. A dry, rattling chuckle emerged from the mahogany. "The radio is the cage. I am the signal. And the cage followed the signal carrier. You carried me across the static void. Now, the amplification begins here." As she spoke, my phone, sitting on my desk, suddenly lit up with an incoming call from an unknown number. It rang only once before displaying a message, "Incoming call from Thomas." Before I could react, the call disconnected, and the phone immediately began playing a sound bite on repeat, the ragged, desperate inhalation I first heard on 98.7 MHz. The sound of a man drowning in bad reception. The entity wasn't just communicating anymore. It was actively using my technology, manipulating the current, and broadcasting from the dead radio. And Thomas was calling from wherever he was trapped, presumably, still deep within the cistern box. My breath hitched. The digitized wheeze of Thomas's struggle was looping from my smartphone speaker, a horrifying counterpoint to the dry, mocking hum emanating from the unplugged Zenith. The radio wasn't just a receiver, it was a transceiver, and my modern electronics were proving to be excellent, high-fidelity amplifiers. The shadowy outline of her began to coalesce near the doorway, the static patches of her eyes seeming to draw the very light from the room, leaving the corners shrouded in unnatural dusk. "He is loud tonight," she hissed, tilting her head, causing the white noise in her eye sockets to churn violently. "He wants to warn you again about the box." How tedious. I knew smashing the radio was useless. If it was just the cage, destroying the mahogany would only release the uncontained signal, directly into my home's wiring, the electrical grid, the very air I breathed. That I remembered the diary. The radio is the channel. The box is the seal. The attic is merely where the signal is amplified. The signal needed amplification to manifest. "What do you need the amplification for?" I demanded, stepping back toward the hall, putting distance between myself and the Zenith. "Why the radio? Why not just possess someone?" She took a slow, gliding step, the floorboards beneath her feet emitting that strange, light pad-pad sound, yet not creaking under her weight. "Possession is messy. It requires acceptance, a weak frequency to piggyback on. This, she gestured toward the zenith with a languid, unnatural motion, this is pure, undiluted signal transfer. We bypassed the mortal shell and anchored directly to the architecture. She paused, her form solidifying slightly, taking on a sickly, grayish tint. But the signal degrades over distance. That old house was too far from the main source. This house is different. Stronger grid. I can finally, download. Download. She wasn't trying to possess me. She was trying to use the house itself, the wiring, the technology, as a vast, localized broadcast antenna to spread whatever she was. Suddenly, every light in the office, the desk lamp, the computer screen, even the faint LED on my surge protector, flickered violently, the power surge making the overhead fluorescent bulb buzz with a sound that matched the zenith's hum. The energy surge was feeding her. You need the power, I choked out, backing toward the circuit breaker panel located near the hull. You need the current. Precisely, she purred, her voice now gaining depth, filling the room beyond the radio. And you just brought the strongest transmitter into the heart of your grid. I reached the circuit breaker panel just as the zenith on the passenger seat of my memory let out a sound, not static, but a triumphant, electronic click that I ripped the cover off the breaker box. Row upon row of switches stared back at me. If she needed the current, I would cut the line that I reached for the main kill switch, the one that would plunge the house into darkness and sever all electrical pathways, but as my fingers touched the plastic lever, the world tilted, the Zenith radio, still unplugged, suddenly jumped on the passenger seat beside me, flipping itself completely upside down. It was now resting on its top panel, revealing the intricate network of vacuum tubes and old wiring beneath, and one of the tubes, a large, glowing orange cylinder, was pulsating, visibly absorbing the ambient electrical activity around it. It was draining power directly from the ambient electromagnetic field of the house, bypassing the need for the wall plug entirely. It was a living battery, the entity across the room laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. Too late, dear host. The amplifier is already charging the beacon. I looked back at the Zenith. The vacuum tube was glowing brighter, and I could see the reflection of the entity in the glass of the tube, her static eyes burning white. I realized cutting the power wasn't enough, the radio was now operating on stored or ambient energy. The main kill switch would only slow the process, not stop it. I had to physically neutralize the Zenith's core. The creature, the static walker, glided slowly toward me from the doorway, her form now almost fully opaque, only her eyes retaining that terrifying, flickering white noise. The resistance is amusing, she droned, her voice weaving through the hum of the power surges. But futile. The transmission is at 40%. Soon, the house itself will be the final step of the broadcast. I ignored her, my eyes fixed on the upturned radio. The glowing vacuum tube was the key. It was the core, the conduit, the beacon she was charging that I scrambled back to the desk, ignoring the rising static pressure in the air. I desperately scanned the contents of the drawer for something non-conductive, something heavy enough to shatter thick glass. I grabbed the first thing my hand closed on, a heavy, obsidian paperweight my grandmother had given me years ago, saying it was too dense for the current to penetrate. I lunged toward the radio, but the static walker was faster. Before my foot even hit the ground, a wave of pure, concentrated static washed over me. It wasn't just sound, it was an impact. My muscles seized up, every hair on my body stood on end, and a searing pain shot through my inner ear, forcing me to drop the paperweight that I collapsed, covering my head, the world reduced to a high-pitched, agonizing screech. This was the entity broadcasting directly into my nervous system. I need you conscious, she hissed, the sound now seemingly inside my head. The initial frequencies require the fear response of the host to calibrate the final setting. It needs to know which wavelengths cause the most delightful distress. I tried to crawl, tried to breathe, but the static was a physical weight, pressing me into the carpet. As the pressure eased slightly, I managed to lift my head and look at the Zenith. The vacuum tube was now glowing with an intense, fiery orange, and the small mahogany casing was beginning to emit a wisp of smoke, a smell like burnt copper and ozone. The charge was almost complete. I saw the obsidian paperweight lying just a foot away. With a superhuman effort powered by sheer, desperate terror, I stretched my arm out, my fingers clawing at the carpet. The static walker was gliding over me now, her icy cold passing over my legs, causing my skin to prickle with frostbite. The final setting is a full-spectrum broadcast of pure panic, she whispered, her spectral form leaning close, the white noise of her eyes overwhelming my vision. A sound wave that will render every mortal within range completely. I grabbed the paperweight. I didn't get up. I just swung my arm up with all my remaining strength and smashed the obsidian down onto the massive, glowing vacuum tube. The resulting sound was not glass shattering. It was a deep, guttural thwomp, the sound of an enormous, pressurized valve bursting open. A flash of blinding white light erupted from the Zenith, followed by a shockwave of frigid air and a cacophony of sound. It was every frequency at once, Thomas's desperate wheezing, the heavy thump-drag, the sweet, synthesized humming of the static walker, all compressed into one agonizing, overwhelming wave of noise, the blast through the static walker backward, her form instantly dissolving from near opacity into a wavering, translucent shadow that was ripped violently toward the broken radio. "No," her voice shrieked, no longer smooth, but raw and full of pure, impotent fury. "The seal! You shattered the internal seal." The Zenith was still glowing, but the orange tube was dark, shattered shards resting in the casing. In its place, where the heat had been, a rapidly growing patch of dense, swirling black smoke was pouring out, like an ink stain spreading in water. It was the negative space, the static void itself. The smoke was drawing the static walker back into the radio, pulling the ethereal shadow toward the broken core, but the entity had one last burst of strength. As she was sucked back, her shimmering shadow lashed out at the nearest conduit of power, the main electrical wiring running into the circuit breaker. With a final, desperate cry, a sound like a dial being ripped off its spindle, the static walker plunged back into the Zenith. The black smoke subsided, leaving only the smell of burnt plastic and silence, but the silence was deceptive. The main circuit breaker, the one I had been reaching for, had fused. The power was still on, but it was broken. The entire house was bathed in a sickly, pulsating yellow light, and every electronic device, my computer, my phone, the microwave downstairs, was emitting a soft, synchronized, high-pitched whine. She was contained, but not defeated. And now she had corrupted the entire grid of my house. I looked at the Zenith. It was dark, silent, and dead. But the humming had been transferred, the sound was now coming from the walls. I stumbled back, my hands trembling, the intense psychic screech of the vacuum tube's rupture still echoing in my bones. The Zenith was inert, a harmless piece of broken furniture now, but the silence it left behind was terrifying. The entity was no longer tethered to a single object, the house was alive, the sickly, pulsating yellow light emanating from every fixture, the hall, the kitchen, the bedrooms, throbbed in rhythm with the synchronized, high-pitched whine from the corrupted electrical grid. The static walker had not been contained, she had simply been transferred from the radio's cage to the house's architecture. I grabbed the diary and stumbled out of the office, past the ruined Zenith. Escape was my only option. I ran down the stairs. Each step felt wrong, the carpet seeming to absorb the sound of my footfalls, amplifying the silent dread. As I reached the bottom landing, the low, insidious whine of the power grid intensified, and the very walls around me began to vibrate. "The circuits are lovely," the static walker whispered, the voice no longer coming from one point, but surrounding me, emanating from the drywall, the foundation, the very plumbing. A complete, internalized network. No need for a messy antenna. I am the signal, and now I am the structure. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. The key turned, but the door wouldn't budge that I pushed against the heavy oak. It was stuck. But it wasn't locked. It was sealed that I looked at the brass plate of the door handle. It was glowing with that same sickly yellow light, and from the edges of the wood frame, thin, black, oily wisps, the remnants of the smoke from the Zenith, were curling out, sealing the gap between the door and the jamb. The house was actively resisting my exit. "Do not leave the current," the walls hummed. "The process of assimilation is not yet complete. I still require the final calibration. The fear response is essential." I stepped back, panting, looking wildly around the living room. The large plasma TV, still plugged into the wall, suddenly flickered to life. Not a broadcast, but pure white, digital snow. The sound, a deafening, crisp hitch, was the purest, most concentrated static I had ever heard. Cutting through the roar, a man's voice, raspy and desperate, screamed from the TV speakers, "The attic is a lie. It's not the attic. The key, it's in the flue. She lied. She wants to trap you with the box. Listen to the weight." It was Thomas, screaming a warning, his voice now amplified through the corrupted network. He wasn't trapped in the box, he was trapped in the signal of his wife's broadcast. He was the ghost in the machine, but his message was confusing. He said my grandmother, she, lied about the key's purpose and wanted me to be trapped with the box. Yet Thomas, in the first broadcast, warned me away from the attic. The static walker's voice immediately overlaid Thomas's, a smooth, contemptuous purr over the static. "My husband is experiencing significant degradation. His signal is weak. I need the host's focus to stabilize the main channel." The white noise on the TV screen began to coalesce. Not into an image, but into a pattern, a repeating geometric symbol made of pure, buzzing white and black. It looked like an esoteric diagram, overlaid with flickering electrical wires that I ran to the kitchen. The kitchen cabinets were humming. The refrigerator's compressor kicked on with an ear-splitting clang. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get outside, away from the power grid. That I smashed the back window with a chair. The glass shattered outward onto the deck. As I climbed through the jagged opening, leaving strips of my shirt and skin behind, the kitchen light fixtures exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. That I dropped onto the deck, scrambled over the railing, and ran across the lawn. That I didn't stop until I reached the street, where the cold, normal night air finally cleansed the oppressive static from my lungs. That I turned back to look at my house. It stood, dark now, except for the back, where the flickering yellow light, like internal organs being revealed, pulsed violently. Then, the final, chilling realization struck me: the Zenith was still unplugged in my office, broken. Yet, the house was sealed, and the static walker was broadcasting through the very walls. That I looked at the diary, still clutched in my hand. I needed to know what the weight was, the thing Thomas warned me to listen to. Safe on the pavement, leaning against a neighbor's mailbox, I forced myself to catch my breath. The house behind me was a silent, dark maw, only occasionally punctuated by the frantic, internal yellow pulsing of the corrupted current. That I opened the diary again, turning past the last legible entry. My grandmother's handwriting was too faint, too small. I looked at the pages that had been ripped out. No, I hadn't lost crucial information. I had been reading the wrong book. The object I had found tied to the key in the chimney flue was the piece of petrified wood, the talisman my grandmother mentioned to keep the static away. And my grandmother had written about the box and the cellar and the attic amplification, but the crucial missing piece was Thomas's side of the story, his final, desperate log that I remembered, the charcoal sketch I found next to Thomas's skeleton in the cistern, the radio inverted, the figure of the static walker emerging from the speaker, and the note written on the back of the slate that I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small slate I had pocketed in my desperate rush from the farmhouse. It was cracked, but the charcoal lines were still clear that I turned the slate over. On the back, in large, crude letters, Thomas had scratched a final, chilling message: do not listen to her warnings. She is trapped in the static. The box is a lie. It is not a seal. It is a conductor she needs to amplify her signal. The key is meant to break the connection that the attic was my cage, not hers. She wants the attic key. She wants the attic. Listen to the weight. That the weight is not a sound. It is a frequency. The third step sticks because the weight is always there. It is not the body. It is the lure. When you hear the weight, you are near the core. It is the sound of a meter turning. When it stops, she is free. Go to the attic. Break the final seal. Break the weight. A wave of sick understanding washed over me. I had misread the entire situation. My grandmother hadn't been warning me away from the cellar to protect me, she had been warning me away from the box, the conductor, and the attic, the final seal, to protect the static walker, her own trapped spirit. The diary entries were written after she became the entity, trying to trick future owners into releasing her. The diary was a lure. Thomas's sketch and note were the real, final warnings, and I had brought the static walker back to my home. That if the Zenith was the cage and the house was the new antenna, then the attic must be the final, necessary component, the terminal point where the broadcast reaches full power. The weight was a frequency, a signal Thomas tried to jam by trapping himself in the cistern with the conductor box that I looked up at my house. The yellow pulse was gone, replaced by total darkness. The house was silent. Too silent, then, from deep within the house, from the structural timbers of the foundation itself, I heard it. A faint, low, repetitive clicking sound, too rhythmic to be natural, click, click, click. It wasn't a thump, or a drag. It was the sound of a mechanical dial turning. The sound of a meter turning. The sound of the weight that it was starting at the foundation and slowly, meticulously, moving upward. The entity was calibrating the house, turning it into the final broadcast station that I had to get back inside. I had to get to the attic. That I ran back toward the house, this time not to escape, but to confront the core. I had one remaining weapon, the knowledge of the static walker's true intentions and the specific instructions left by Thomas. That I found the kitchen window I had broken, climbed back inside, and moved through the pitch-black house. The clicking sound of the weight grew steadily louder as I moved toward the center of the house. Click, 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 I reached the main hall. The staircase was a black void, then the clicking stopped, absolute silence. The weight had reached its destination. From the top of the stairs, a single light flickered on, not a sickly yellow, but a bright, blinding white light coming from my attic office, and from that light, the static walker's voice boomed, no longer a whisper, but a high-powered broadcast that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. Welcome back, host. The final calibration is complete. The attic is ready. I started my ascent. The weight was gone. The broadcast was about to begin. I took the stairs two at a time, moving toward the blinding white light pouring from the attic office door. The air on the second floor was thick and charged, smelling sharply of ozone, like standing directly beneath a high-voltage power line. As I reached the top landing, the static walker's voice boomed again, shaking the entire structure. You cannot interrupt the frequency. The host's fear has already set the dial. I am broadcasting. I threw open the attic office door. The sight was overwhelming. The room wasn't just lit, it was overdriven. The walls were shimmering with electrical energy, and a field of pure, crackling white noise filled the air. My original Zenith radio, the shattered one, was sitting upright on the floor again, its wounds gone, its mahogany casing glowing faintly orange, but the focal point was the center of the room. The static walker was there, fully corporeal now, a woman of flickering, gray-white substance, tethered to the ceiling by thousands of thin, pulsing strands of black electrical wire that ran directly into the attic rafters and down the walls. She was the junction box, and on the floor, directly beneath her feet, was the source of the weight, a small, circular device, unlike anything I had seen. It looked like a miniature, ancient clockwork mechanism with a glowing red needle, spinning wildly across a dial marked from 0 to 100. It wasn't a clock or a radio, it was a frequency meter. As I watched, the needle hit 98.7. Full power, the static walker screamed triumphantly, throwing her arms wide. Her voice was pure sound, excruciatingly loud, and my vision swam. The weight is the meter. I yelled over the din, clutching Thomas's charcoal slate. You need it to transmit the frequency. Thomas said, break the final seal. I looked frantically for what Thomas meant by the final seal. The radio was inert, the house was the antenna, and the meter was the weight. Then I saw it. Tucked high into the corner of the attic, exactly where I had first found the radio, was a small, crudely built wooden box. It wasn't the ornate iron one from the cellar, this was a simple, unfinished pine box, nailed shut. That I remembered the very first thing Thomas warned me about, tell them not to go to the attic. And the diary's last, true warning, he wants the attic key. She wants the attic. Listen to the weight. The attic was Thomas's original cage, the one he had tried to move downstairs into the iron box, the conductor, to draw the entity out of the house. The static walker noticed my gaze and shrieked. No. You do not touch the anchor. It is my only safeguard against the static void. I realized my grandmother, Thomas's wife, had been the entity all along, but Thomas had been trying to protect her, not trap her. The iron box was the conductor, meant to draw her spectral essence out. The pine box was the original, temporary containment, the anchor that kept her tethered, not to the house, but to Thomas's memory of her. That I sprinted toward the pine box, grabbing a nearby, rusted pipe left over from a renovation. The static walker unleashed a focused wave of static aimed directly at me. It felt like a physical punch, forcing me to my knees, the air sizzling around my skin. I am your grandmother. Do not do this. I only want to be heard. The world needs to hear my voice. Your voice is a lie. I screamed back, fighting the pressure. Your voice is just the sound of a meter turning. Thomas said to break the final seal. I pushed myself up, ignored the agony, and swung the pipe like a madman, smashing it directly into the side of the small, pine box. The wood split with a dry, ripping sound. Inside, there was no key, no bones, no ritual object. There was only a single, ordinary, black electrical cord, cut clean at both ends, tied into a tight, impossible knot. A dead knot. As the box broke, the static walker let out a final, tearing howl that sounded like a million people disconnecting from the internet all at once. The spinning frequency meter beneath her feet exploded in a shower of sparks, and the blinding white light in the room instantly vanished. The room plunged into absolute darkness and silence. That I stood there, gasping, waiting for the counterattack. the final, desperate search, but nothing happened. The house was utterly dead. No pulsing yellow light, no humming walls, no static. The current had been broken. The dead knot was the true, final seal Thomas had used to anchor the entity's tether and keep it from fully manifesting, a final, non-electrical circuit breaker that I turned on my phone flashlight. The static walker was gone. The Zenith was still on the floor, now looking like nothing more than an antique radio. The house was silent, inert, lifeless, that I was safe. The silence was absolute, heavier than the static had ever been. It felt like the entire house had finally exhaled a breath held for 70 years that I stumbled out of the ruined attic, leaving the shattered Zenith and the splintered pine box behind. The air on the lower floors was cool and still, the sickly yellow pulse gone. Every light fixture and appliance in the house was dead, confirming that the short circuit the static walker had created was now a permanent, complete grid failure. That I made it back outside just as the first rays of dawn touched the horizon. I walked across the lawn to the neighbor's mailbox, retrieving the keys and the charcoal slate. The house was just a house again, ordinary, damaged, but inert, that I decided not to call the police or the power company. Explaining a sentient radio, a spectral grandmother, and a self-sealing house seemed an exercise in futility. I simply packed my car with the essentials, drove to a hotel, and began arranging for contractors to deal with the inevitable repairs to the electrical grid and structural damage. A week later, I was living in a temporary apartment, avoiding my house and the ghosts it contained. The Zenith, the diary, and Thomas's slate were locked away in a storage unit, safe, but out of reach. That I had tried to make sense of the final warning: the weight is not a sound. It is a frequency. It was the frequency that the house itself was broadcasting, but Thomas's final seal had broken the circuit. Or so I thought. One evening, I received a package at my temporary address. It was from the contractor who was cleaning out the attic debris at my old house. Inside the package was a single item, the small, ornate brass key that I had used to unlock the cistern. It wasn't tarnished anymore, it was polished, almost glowing. Attached to the key was a small, handwritten note from the contractor: found this stuck to the inside of the wall paneling by the old circuit breaker. We had to pry it out. Weird thing, it feels warm to the touch. It seems to have been transmitting something, almost like a faint vibration, into the wall. Thought you'd want it back. Transmitting something. A faint vibration. That I held the key. It was indeed warm. And as I held it, pressed between my fingers, I felt that familiar, rhythmic pressure begin to build in my eardrums. That it wasn't the high-pitched static. It wasn't the thump-drag. It wasn't the mechanical click of the weight. That it was a profound, low-frequency hum, deep in the bass register, that seemed to vibrate my very bones. That I immediately recognized the pattern. It was the same rhythm as the static hum the static walker had used when she was first coalescing in the hallway, the smooth, manufactured sound that was devoid of natural breath. That I rushed to my laptop and pulled up an online frequency generator. I started sweeping the low-end spectrum, trying to match the vibration I felt through the key. That I found it at 98.7 Hz, not megahertz, but hertz. A low, subsonic sound frequency. The same numerical designation as the radio's dead air position. That I hit the play button on the generator. The sound was a deep, resonating drone, barely audible, but deeply felt. Suddenly, the screen on my laptop, the one broadcasting the sound, began to flicker. Not with yellow light, but with the same swirling, monochromatic white noise I had seen in the static walker's eyes, and the low, resonant drone changed. It morphed, the smooth wave corrupted by a subtle, underlying texture. That it was the sound of a voice, synthesized by the low frequency, being stretched into an endless, agonizing drone. The circuit is broken. The low hum resonated through the speakers, seeming to wrap around me, vibrating my chair. But the frequency is eternal. I have the weight. It's carried on the low wave now. Your key is the new broadcast point. The static walker wasn't trapped in the house. She had transferred herself into the lowest, most fundamental frequency of the electrical grid, the very hum of existence, and the key was now the permanent, portable receiver that I threw the key against the wall. The hum persisted, now coming from my laptop speakers, from the air, from my own mind that I couldn't destroy the electrical hum of the planet. I had only forced the broadcast frequency lower, wider, and more omnipresent. The static walker was everywhere now, trapped forever in the background noise of life that I unplugged the laptop, tearing the battery out, plunging the room into silence. But when I put my ear close to the bare electrical outlet on the wall, I could still feel it, that low, bone-vibrating hum, click, click, click. The meter was turning again, slowly, calibrating the next frequency. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that I would never find a place quiet enough to escape the sound of the weight.